Hey everyone, and welcome back to the React for Beginners series. In the last episode, we went over one of the key features of React and managing state. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at handling events. Handling events is very important in React because it's what allows us to change our state exactly how we want and when we want. Then we'll look at a React function called useEffect that will also come in handy. We've already done a couple of event handling things here and there in our previous episodes, but in this episode, we'll do a deeper dive to get a full understanding of how events work in React. First, to start off, there's two tags we're going to focus on and cover: onChange and onClick. The very last thing we left off with was a text box that we made as a component, and then we rendered it into our app.jsx file. Whenever we type something in this text box, our state is automatically updated and printed out right below our text box. So let's do a quick review of how this works so we're fully clear on this concept. So let's go ahead and take a look at our textbox.jsx component. In the last episode, we made this component, and as part of our input field, which represents our actual text box, we have this property right here that we call onChange that runs some chunk of code, which the code that it runs is just this here with this argument e and then set text to e.target.value. I went over it pretty quickly in the last episode, so let me clarify how this works and how this actually updates our state. So input is the actual JSX tag that creates a text box for us automatically. Inside of the opening tag, just as with any other HTML or JSX opening tags, we can specify things like class name, ID, and all sorts of other things. With JSX specifically, we can specify event properties that basically signal for something to happen when some action occurs. Anytime we have any of these properties like onChange here, what we can do is write equals and then pass in some chunk of code, that being this chunk of code here, that we want to run whenever the event occurs or gets triggered. onChange specifically is a property that gets triggered when anything inside the text box is altered in any way. So if I go into this text box here and I type one letter, the onChange runs. If I delete this letter, onChange runs. If I type 5 letters, onChange will run each of the 5 times I add a letter. Any change at all will trigger this onChange run, meaning every time I add a letter or delete a letter or modify something, this chunk of code here is running. And as always, when we're executing any JavaScript code inside of JSX notation, we want to make sure we use curly brackets surrounding whatever JavaScript code we're going to enter, hence why we're using curly brackets around this chunk of code here. So what is this chunk of code actually doing then? We have an arrow function here that has one argument, which we just call e, and then inside that function, we're calling our state setter function setText, which we went over last episode. This setter function sets the value of our text state. Inside of it, we're passing in e.target.value. So what is this whole e thing that we have going on here? It doesn't matter what we name this parameter, but it's typically standard practice to just use e because it stands for event. Now, why are we doing e.target.value right here? Well, let me just right click on this page here and open up the console, which you can normally just do by clicking inspect here. So console.log is JavaScript version of a print function, and it prints out in this console that you're seeing here if we just go ahead and go to this console tab. So if we ever use console.log, it'll now show up in this console menu here. And then let's go back to our code real quick. And then instead of having set text here, let's just go ahead and console log this e event. So instead of saying set text, I'm just going to replace this with console.log e like this. And then I'm going to go ahead and save this and then reopen our console menu here. And then I'm just going to delete a letter, and you see it prints this off. I'm going to type a letter, it prints this. I'll do this and keep going. And basically anytime this onChange event is triggered, which again is anytime that I type a letter or delete a letter, it will now go ahead and just run this console log e, which means that this event here being triggered is e. You'll notice all of these objects or events are just called synthetic base event. And if we can click this arrow here, it opens it up so we can see all the properties of this object. Now, notice how we have a property here named target. And then if we open up and expand target, at the very top here, we have a property named value. If we click on these 3 dots here to go ahead and open it up, you can see that this is the actual text that we have just typed, as you can see reflected by our text box over here to the left. So basically, to get the text from a text field every time something is changed, we need to go into this event, which we just know as e. Then we need to look at the target property here. And then within that target property, we need to look at the value property. Hence why if you look at our code and we go back to what we were doing here, when you go back to doing set text with e.target.value, this is why we do e.target.value, because if we look at this event is e, we have this target property here, and then we have this value property within the target, hence why we use that notation. Let's go back into our code now and look at another thing we can do with onChange or just events in general. In this line of code with our onChange here that we have, we can only really commit one action because we can only pass in a single function definition to it. But what if we wanted to do multiple things on some of it? So to do this, we can make a separate function within our component that will handle the event. So inside this text box, I'm actually going to make a function up here. I'm just going to make a new function. I'm going to write function handle event. Then we're going to pass an e, which will be our argument for our event. And then with the parentheses here, make some space. Now let's change this onChange to say e handle event instead of setting text. So I'm going to call the function we just made, which doesn't do anything just yet, but will in a second. And then I'm just going to go ahead and pass an e. So we're just passing in the event as the event argument to our handle event function, which we're going to make in just a second. Just a moment ago, we switched between setting the text state and console logging the event. Let's actually do both now so we can commit more than one action within an event handler. So at the top of the function here, let's just go ahead and call our state setter function. So we're going to do set text, and we're going to do e.target.value. Oops, if I can spell it right. You target a value like that, which is just the same line of code that we had before. And then underneath that, let's also do a console log. So let's go ahead and say console.log. We're going to say the text has just changed. And then we're just going to go ahead and under this, let's do another console log. And let's just console log our actual event. So basically, every single time our text changes, we're calling this handle event function right here because we're passing it into our onChange. Whenever we do this function here, all we're doing is setting the state of our text using our setter function, which is defined up here, which we went over last episode. And then we're just console logging two things. We're console logging a string that just says the text has changed. And then we're also console logging the actual event that we're passing into our event handler. Now let's go ahead and save this file. And I'm actually going to refresh this page to wipe the console out. I'm going to open the console here. And then every single time we're going to type anything, three things are going to happen. Let's see. I'm going to type A. The state is going to update, which reflects down here. And then it's going to print off that the text has just changed. And then it is going to print off the event. And that happens because that's what we specified here. Those are the exact steps. The state changes, we console log the text has just changed, and then we go ahead and console log E. If I, let's say, type 3 letters instead of just one, I do one more and then one more. You can clearly see that every single time a change is being made, we are having 3 events happen. The state is updating, we are console logging the text has changed, and then we are console logging the event. And obviously, again, that happens on deletes as well. So if we were to delete letters or change letters, it happens every single time, and we're going to get a pretty full console if we just keep doing that. Now, going back into our code, one of the most common mistakes that I see React beginners make is this. Instead of passing in a function definition to these event tags right here, they instead just pass in a function call. So what I mean by that is in this text box here, we're actually fully defining a function using arrow notation. Let's say I didn't need this E object and I just wanted to run this handle event function. So if I were to just, for instance, delete all this extra stuff with the arrow notation, and I were to delete this, and I were to just be doing a direct function call with handle event E, this does not work because this is just a function call, but we need an actual function definition. If I wanted to run this handle event function without passing in an event, I need to use parentheses still, but just have them empty. So don't fall into the trap of passing in just a function call because I see it happen all the time. Always write a function definition by specifying arguments inside the parentheses or just empty parentheses if there are no arguments. Use an arrow to denote that it's actually a function, and then write whatever code you need to do on the right side of the arrow. So let's just go ahead and Control Z, get it back to normal because this is the actual format that we want and the format that actually works. Now that we have a solid grasp of how onChange work, let's look at another property onClick, which you've already had a little bit of practice with. onClick is probably the most common event property you're going to see in React. Why? Well, every single button you click on a web page has some onClick event. So to make React web pages interactive, you need onClick properties on a lot of things. So let's actually go back into our button component here that we made in one of our previous episodes. And then in our button component, we left off with a button tag that just has an onClick property inside of it. Lucky for us, the syntax of onClick is identical to that of onChange. The only difference is what actually triggers the event. Well, the name is pretty self-evident, but onClick means the event is triggered whenever the tag that is inside is clicked. So we have our onClick inside of our button tag here, specified right here. And then, therefore, if this button is clicked, we are running this chunk of code right here, which is basically just calling our setCountSetter function and then passing in count plus 1, which is just incrementing our count state variable by 1. Just so we can see what this button's doing again, let's go ahead and go into our app.jsx file. And instead of rendering in text box, let's actually go ahead and just render in button again. Then we'll go ahead and save this, and we are now back to having a button. Just like I mentioned a moment ago, we want to make sure we're passing in an actual function definition here to our event handler. So we have parentheses and then an arrow to show the arrow function. If I were to delete the parentheses and arrow and just simply call the state function setCount, let's see what happens. So if I were to delete this and make it just a function call instead of a function definition and go ahead and saved it, look, my button disappears. And then if I go ahead and open the console here, we're getting a hell of a lot of errors because it's saying we have infinite re-renders. Because we're passing in a function call and not a function definition, React thinks we're trying to just keep calling this function over and over and over again, which causes it to crash. So long story short, always have the parentheses and the arrow. Again, don't pass in a function call here to event handler, pass in a function definition. So I'll go ahead and just save this file again. And if we look at this button we made before and we click it, you can see that it just increments it each time we click it, which basically is just counting the number of clicks that it actually has. So why is this doing this? Well, remember with useState that we're initializing our count variable to 0 because we're specifying 0 within the actual useState function here. And then, just like we did with onChange, we have an event handler here. This time onClick that runs every time the button is clicked. The function we're calling in here is setCount, which is just our setter function that we made up here. And all we're doing is passing in count plus 1, which is basically just incrementing the count by 1 each time it is clicked. And because we're printing out our count state within our p tag inside the button, we're just printing off the count inside the button itself, hence why it is showing and updating in real time. There are tons and tons of options of things we can do with an onClick event, but one of the options would be to have a function that handles the event, just like we had with onChange. So let's actually go, and just like we did with onChange, let's make a function here. Let's say function handle event, and then I'm just not going to pass in any argument for now. I'm going to do curly brackets just so we know it is a function here. Now let's just say, just like last time, we want to log something to the console while altering our state. Inside the function, let's actually call setCount here, and let's pass in count plus 1, which is literally just what we're doing right here in this function. And then below that, let's just do this console log. We'll say state has been incremented by 1. And then all I want to do is, instead of calling setCount here, let's just call our handle event function that we have just created. So effectively, what this is doing is that anytime this onClick property is triggered, we are running this handle event function here, which just sets the count in the same way we were doing before, and then console logs that state has been incremented by 1. So we'll go ahead and just save this now. And then notice how this time we're not passing in any actual event as an argument, like we have empty parentheses here. And that's just because we don't actually need to access the event for what we're trying to do, but we could add it if we wanted to do something else. Now, make sure this code is saved. I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page here. So we have a blank console. And then now if we click this button, you can see it prints out the state has been incremented by 1. So it's really doing two actions. It's updating the state, which you can see reflected by this button here because it's updating in real time. And then it is also printing out the state has been incremented by 1 because we are also console logging that. And you can see that every single time that we click it, it is running again, and it's just stacking the same line here. So that's why it says 14. Because it has run 14 separate times. And that's really all you need to know from a basic standpoint to get started using events using onChange and onClick. Both of them work in the same way. They both take in some function that runs whenever the event occurs. onChange occurs when some element like a text field is changed, and onClick happens when a user clicks an element like a button. Although we don't just have to have onClick inside of a button tag, we could literally have it in any other tag we wanted to. Like we could put this onClick, for instance, inside of our p tag here, and it would work pretty much just the same. It does not have to be in a button. It can be wherever you want. So as the last part of this video, I want to get into something extremely important in React and state management in general. One of the common ways to change state is what we just went over with events like onClick and onChange. However, what if you don't want to change state within one of these conditions, or you want to change state based on another piece of state? That's where this next function comes in, and it's called useEffect. So just like useState, useEffect is a function from React that allows us to manage the state. Before I go into what it is used for, let's quickly import it up here. And we can actually just add a comma after useState. So I'm going to say comma useEffect like this, and then press enter as well. Since they're both from React, so we're both importing them from React here. So you can just add a comma next to useState here. Let's just go ahead and save this file. So useEffect has two use cases in React. Use case number 1, the reason for its name, is to handle some effect. An effect occurs if we change some other piece of state and want to listen for that change to happen. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say we want to have some chunk of code run every time this count variable is changed here. A useEffect would listen for this count to change and then every time it is changed, it would just run. The second use case of useEffect is to do some action every time the page loads, but not after that. We know that React re-renders a component every single time the state is changed, but what if you want to have some chunk of code that doesn't run upon re-render and only runs once the page is first loaded? We can also use useEffect for that, and I'll show you how to separate out these two use cases. So let's look at the first use case, which will be to just run some chunk of code whenever the state is changed. So to call the use function or the useEffect function that we just imported, all we need to do is type useEffect like this, and then parentheses for its argument. And then it takes in two arguments. The first argument is a function, and the second argument is a dependency array, which I'll go over in just a second. For the first argument, let's just write an empty arrow function by just doing parentheses, arrow, and then I'm going to do curly brackets, and I'm just going to make a space just so it looks a little bit neater and easier to read. And then for the second argument here, let's just pass in a empty array for now, and this will be what is called a dependency array. So again, takes in two arguments. The first argument here is a function, which encompasses all the empty space here, and the second argument here will always be an array. So what does this array actually do? Well, this is what we call a dependency array, and it's how we specify the pieces of state we want to watch out for. Anytime any variables inside the dependency array are changed, this useEffect function will run. So let's add count to this dependency array here. So we're going to go ahead and just add count inside of here. And then I'm actually going to delete this handle event function for right now, and then change our code here back to just setting the count, just so we can unclutter this and make it a little easier to read. So change this back to count. Go ahead and just save this page like that here. Okay, so now what's going to happen here? Well, every time we click this button, we're going to increment the count by 1. This useEffect function has count in its dependency array. So every time our count variable changes, this first function here that we have, this first argument, is going to run. And right now we don't have anything in it, so let's actually add something. So inside this useEffect, let's just add a console log here line. Let's say console.log. We're going to say count is now equal to, and we'll do plus here, and then set equal to count. So basically every time the count is incremented, this useEffect function should say count is now equal to, and then whatever it is equal to. And because this useEffect function has count in its dependency array, that means that every single time this count variable changes, this function is going to run. So basically, every time we click our button, that is changing count. When count changes, then this function runs, meaning we're going to console log out count is now equal to whatever. So to show you this in action, let me go ahead and just save this file here. I'm going to open up the console here. Let's clear this out and refresh. And then you can see it has started off initially saying count is equal to 0. And then let's look at what happens every time we click this button. I click it right here. We're changing the state of count. Therefore, this useEffect is running. So it says count is now equal to 1 because we have run this line inside of our useEffect here. If we go back, run it again, count is now equal to 2, count is 3, count is 4, count is 5, so forth, and you get the picture. This is because every single time this onClick is running, we're changing the state of count, and because count is the dependency array, therefore we are running this chunk of code. Therefore, every single click means we are printing off that the count is now equal to whatever it currently is. So let me show you something interesting real quick that you might have noticed when you first loaded the page. So if we just refresh the page, actually I'll exit this out here, and I just go ahead and refresh. Without even clicking the button, you'll see that it has already console logged our count has just changed line. So why is this? Well, every time a component loads for the very first time, the stuff inside the useEffect will run before any event happens. And notice how it actually ran twice inside of here. So the first run happens right when the page is loaded up, just like I said. The second run happens because whenever we call this useState function here, we're actually setting our count variable, which is technically changing it, causing this useEffect to actually run. And then anytime after that, it only runs when it is clicked. So notice, like I said, it runs twice when it first loads. Then after that, it only runs, once, obviously, each time it is clicked. To show you how the dependency array affects the useEffect function, let's change some things around in our code. So let's actually clear this count out of our dependency array and just make it so that the array is completely empty. And then if we go ahead and just save this, let's go look at our console again. Let's clear this out and let's go ahead and refresh. Obviously, we have these things now saying count is not equal to 0, but then notice every time we click it, nothing is being console logged off. And no amount of clicks is going to trigger this useEffect function now, because since it is empty in the dependency array, this means that it will only run right when the first page is loaded up, and we're not running it every single time count is changed now because it's no longer in the dependency array. Therefore, when you click it, nothing actually happens now. Because this is actually an array here and not just like a single variable, we can have as many pieces of state here as we wanted. So let's make another piece of state up here. Let's just do const, and we're going to say count2 and then set count2. These are not very good naming conventions, but for now I'm just trying to get this idea across. And we'll say useState0. This will also be initialized at 0. So then we'll go ahead and save this. And then now let's make another actual button to monitor our second count. So I'm going to copy and paste this entire button chunk here. And then I'm actually just going to paste that here. I need to tab to get it a little bit nicer, like this. And then I'm going to make sure everything here says set count2 and then count. So I'm going to change this to set count2. Let's say count2. And then we will say count2 right here. And then notice that everything is being highlighted red right now. It's getting mad that we don't have a single tag being returned. Instead, we have like 2 separate buttons. So let's just go ahead and make some empty tags here just to encompass everything. So I'm going to do this, do it like that. And then let's just tab this in, make it look a little neater. And then go ahead and save it. And voila, now we have 2 buttons. And then now let's actually add both of our count state variables into our dependency array back in. So I add count back in here. And then we're just going to go ahead and add count2 like this. And then if we go ahead and save this and open up the console, go ahead and clear this out. Now, every time we click either of the buttons, it is going to run this line of code here. And then I could click this one and it would do the same thing. And then I could just keep going pretty much infinitely. And actually now, because we have 2 buttons here, technically it's not correct what it's printing off because we're actually just printing off count. So I'm just going to go ahead and just change this just for now, just to say count has just changed. Go ahead and save that, open up our console, clear this out, refresh it, and then now anytime either of the buttons is clicked, it's going to print out count has just changed. And again, it's just stacking it here, 18 different clicks. So we can just keep clicking it, and every single time it'll print out count has just changed. And it works on both button 1 and button 2 because we have 2 things in our dependency array, not just 1. So anytime either of these variables are changed, the useEffect will run. And that's an important point to make, that it does not mean that both of them have to change. It just means that one of them in the array has to change for the useEffect to run. So if just one of these is changed, like count2, it'll run. If just count and not count2 is changed, it'll also run, because it is kind of an or thing and not an and thing. Although, note that we're still using console logging that count has just changed. What if we want to have separate effects for each of the counts? So I print something different off between each one. We could always just make another useEffect to do this. So I'm actually going to remove count2 from this useEffect here, so it just has count. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste this useEffect here. I'm going to copy it and paste it like this. And instead of saying count in this one, I'm just going to go ahead and say this in count2 here. And then right here, we're going to say count2 has just changed. And we'll go ahead and save this file. Now that they're separated, anytime we click button 1, the first useEffect will run here. Anytime we click button 2, the second useEffect will run. And that all depends on which state we're modifying with our onClick events down here in our JSX. So to show you this, if we just go ahead and make sure this file is saved, we go in our console here, let's go ahead and clear it out. I'll just completely refresh here. And then we can click on whatever button we want. Let's say we want to click on button 1 first. It'll print off count has just changed, count has just changed, count has just changed each time. Then we want to click button 2. Now it's printing off count 2 has just changed. So we can click each one, we can go back and forth. Count has just changed, count 2 has just changed. Count has just changed, count 2 has just changed, and so forth. Hopefully you get the picture. And again, just so we're on the same page, if I were to instance click the first button like this, what that is doing is triggering this onClick event in the first function, which is then setting our count to be incremented by 1. And then, because the count variable is modified, this useEffect function is going to recognize that, since count is in a dependency array, and it's going to console log this line here and go ahead and run this function. And the same logic applies for button 2. Button 2 has this onClick property here that just modifies count2. This useEffect has count2 in the dependency array, so it recognizes that it's just changed, and every time it is changed, it just console logs count2 has just changed. And now, because I've got 2 pieces of state, these 2 pieces of state are unique and hold their own individual count numbers, meaning count2 and count1 go up separately depending on how much we click each button. So hopefully now you should have a decent understanding of how useEffect works and what it does, and what its actual dependency array looks like and what that does as well. Now I want to shift our focus to look at the second use case of useEffect, which you've already actually seen. The second use case was to run some chunk of code just when the first component loads, which we already did with our first count. That's exactly what happened when we removed all items from our dependency array and made it empty. So let's actually, for now, let's go ahead and delete the second button here. And let's look at the first button just so I can get this point across. So I'm going to delete this first button here, and then I'm just going to go ahead and delete this second useEffect here. And then I'm just going to go ahead and save it, just so we're back with working with one button and one useEffect to make it a little simpler. Now let's actually make a new useEffect. And this time I'm going to make the dependency array completely empty. So inside of this new useEffect function, let's just type it out. I want to make it up here. I'm going to make a new useEffect here. Make an arrow function like normal for our first argument. And then let's just make a dependency array for now. And then inside of the useEffect function, all I'm going to do is just, for now, console.log page has just been rendered. So because when we have an empty dependency array, that means this useEffect will only run once the page is first rendered. And it won't run on any following events unless the page has been reloaded completely. To show you this, if we just go ahead and make sure our page is saved and we go ahead and open our console, let's do this. Let's just go ahead and refresh this. You can see it'll say page has just been rendered and it says count has just been changed. And then if we click this button, we're only invoking the second useEffect since count is being changed and count is in the dependency array. However, notice that we're never invoking the first useEffect again because it'll only run once the page is first loaded if it is completely empty in the dependency array. So what do I mean when I mention the page has to be completely reloaded for this useEffect to run again? Well, you need to have some event like a refresh that completely remounts the component. I won't get into the advanced aspects of it, but basically as soon as a component is first rendered, we'll say it is mounted. And even though it may re-render a bunch of times due to state changes, it still stays mounted that whole time. The only thing that'll cause it to get mounted again is if we completely render the page from scratch again, like refresh it like this. Hence why the useEffect will now run again every time the page is completely reloaded or refreshed. One of the very common use cases for this type of useEffect is if we need to load data into a component. Let's say we have an external source of data like a database that we're calling and grabbing data from. If we want to grab the data within a component, we don't want to call this database every single time the page is re-rendered, because then it would call the database anytime any state changed at all. So if we used a useEffect with no dependency array, just like we're doing at this one, we could easily have a way to load data into the component when it first renders. Loading data from an external source is a bit more advanced, so we're going to go over it in this tutorial, but I'll definitely go over that in a future video. Before you end this episode though, I need to go over a huge pitfall of React beginners. I myself fell into this trap so many times when I was first getting started out, and it was incredibly frustrating trying to figure out what I was doing wrong. Do not, and I repeat, do not modify state within a useEffect that has that piece of state in the dependency array. So for example, in this useEffect here, we have count in our dependency array. If I go into this useEffect now, and I modify this count, and I say set count plus 1, let's actually analyze what happens here. So the page first renders, both these useEffects are going to run. And then inside of this, we're modifying the count to be equal to count plus run. Our dependency array here now sees that count has been changed, so it runs the useEffect again, which then triggers the count to run, which then this will see that it has been changed, so the function runs once again. So do you see the problem here? We're creating an infinite loop. If we modify the state inside the useEffect of something that is in the dependency array, we're going to infinitely run the useEffect function. Don't believe me? Well, watch this. Let's leave this console log here. Just keep a set count here, and I'm going to go ahead and save this. And look what's happening. This button is being infinitely incremented by 1, and it's never going to stop unless I stop it. So I'm actually really quick just going to delete this before I completely crash my program. I'm just going to do that, Control Save, and now it's stopped. But it was running for a good amount of time, and now it's at 143,000, which means our component re-rendered 143,000 times because of the infinite loop we just created. So let's just go ahead and just go back to console logging this, saying count has just changed. Long story short, don't do what I just did or you'll create an infinite loop. It might crash your program. Another hugely common mistake I see is developers changing the state of their code in just the function itself or the component itself, instead of putting it inside of an event like onClick or putting it inside of a useEffect function. So if I just go into the bulk part of the component without even putting it inside of useEffect or an event handler, and I just write set count plus 1, kind of out here open, and it's not inside of the thing, then this page isn't going to load for the exact same reason as before. All of this code within our button component is going to rerun every time the state changes. So if the state changes in this main chunk of code here, that means it'll again create an infinite loop of re-rendering. And in fact, if I actually save this and try and run it now, it won't even infinitely increment the button anymore. The page will just straight up crash. So if you actually just look in the console, you can see it just straight up crashed here. We're getting a bunch of errors. And it's saying too many re-renders. React limits the number of renders to prevent an infinite loop, because that is exactly what would happen. So in summary, mistake 1 is changing the state inside of a useEffect that has the same state in the dependency array, which I showed you with the infinitely incrementing button. And mistake 2 is what we just saw, which is changing the state inside of the function itself. So let's go ahead and delete this. Let's make sure we get to a point we're not going to infinitely render our app anymore. Save it, and now our button is back to normal and is no longer going to crash. So if you're going to modify state, you need to do it in some event like onClick or onChange, or you need to do it inside of a useEffect that doesn't have that same state in the dependency array. So you could do it inside of a useEffect with no dependency array, or you could do it in a useEffect that doesn't have that piece of state in the array. For example, let's say I have another piece of state called filter. So I'm going to go ahead and actually delete this line here. I'm going to copy this line and then paste it. Let's make a new piece of state. I'm going to say filter, and then we're going to say set filter, and then we're going to say use state and set it to none by default. And then let's say in this useEffect here, where we're doing our count, we have count in our dependency array. So I could call set filter in here. Just say set filter plus like L or something. And nothing bad is going to happen because filter is not in the dependency array of this useEffect. So modifying in the useEffect is perfectly fine. But if I were to do something like this, and I were to add filter to the dependency array, now that's a problem because we're making it an infinite loop. And just to show you this, if I were to just do something like console.log filter here, and then I were going to save this and open up our console, it's going to get real chaotic in just a second. I can save it, look at our console, and look what's going on. And it's actually, I think, crashing my console because I can't really scroll. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete this before it crashes my program again. Let's just delete this line here like that. Let's go ahead and save it so it stops infinitely rerunning our program. Again, just to drive this point home, just be very careful about where you're modifying the state and that you're doing it in a way that won't cause an infinite loop. And with that, we're going to wrap up this episode of managing state and handling events. In this episode, you learn how to deal with events using JSX tags like onClick and onChange, as well as learn how to properly manage state using React's useEffect function. In the next episode, we'll go over rendering lists and conditional rendering of certain items or components. These two things are hugely valuable skills that'll open up the doors of React development and allow you to actually build some pretty cool things. I'll see you in the next one.